Hello to my wine friends. I made a New Year's resolution to try and spend a bit more time getting into the groove of making some of these wine videos. So, fresh start for 2025. I figured let's start with champagne since it's close enough to that celebration time of year. Hopefully, you all still have a bit of champagne on your tongue. What we're going to talk about today, learning a few things. One, what makes champagne champagne? So, something about the making of champagne and why a Prosecco is not a champagne. I'll talk about vintage versus non-vintage champagne, a bit on how to serve and what kind of foods to pair it with, and then how to read the label on a bottle of champagne and how to start to find out what style of champagne you might like. So let's start out with what makes champagne champagne. Number one is where it's produced. It's produced in Champagne. It's a region in France. You cannot call it champagne unless it was produced there. Some people don't like that the French protect the labeling of champagne and they think that all sparkling wine should be able to be called champagne. I don't agree with this. There's also protecting the consumer by making sure that if the bottle says champagne, you know what's inside the bottle. Now, of course, the producers of champagne are also protecting themselves at the same time, but I like to be able to look at a bottle, see it labeled as champagne, and I know some things about the wine. So like I said first, I know where it was produced. What's key about where champagne is produced is the weather there. It's very difficult to grow grapes. They have years where they lose the complete crop. The weather is challenging. You get late frost in spring, which can lose a whole crop. So it's a challenging location. The weather is challenging. There are certain grapes that you could use in Champagne. There are like 8 grapes. Almost no one uses 5 of the 8 grapes. You'd be hard pressed to find something that isn't some combination of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. You could also have a champagne that's made with only one of those grapes, and I'll come back to how that's described on the label. So we know what grapes are in there. Now let's go to the method of producing champagne. This method, it can also be applied to some other wines, and they will use different terms. I think for some time they were using méthode champenoise, and I think that might not be allowed anymore. South Africa calls it cap classique. Also in Cava, they use the same, they don't describe it. Sometimes they'll use méthode traditionnelle. And if you see that on a bottle of wine, means it was made like champagne. What does that mean? First of all, you have to produce a base wine. We'll get to vintage and non-vintage in a second. You have a base wine. You can blend these base wines, and then you have to put them in the bottle. Key thing with champagne is the gas, the sparkling nature of it is produced by second fermentation in the bottle. So you have still wine in the bottle. Now to ferment, you need to then put yeast and sugar into the wine. So they will add into every bottle a dose of yeast and sugar. Then they will seal the bottle. They actually seal it usually with a beer bottle cap, not a cork, because it's a lot easier and less prone to contamination to use this beer bottle cap. So they then cap the champagne and it will start to ferment. And by fermenting in a sealed bottle, it causes the CO2 that is released during fermentation. It then embeds itself into the wine itself. Now, what you end up with is a wine with dead yeast inside the bottle, because dead yeast is the byproduct of the fermentation process. What they then need to do is they invert the bottles. You could use this gyro type of machine, or traditionally they put it in like this wood rack where they invert the bottle. And then someone would come by and by hand every day or every period of time, they would slightly rotate each of the bottles such that the yeast is then not sticking to the side of the bottle, and it gradually all falls by gravity towards the neck of the bottle, and all of the yeast will be at the end. Now you got a pile of yeast in the neck of an inverted bottle. You need to figure out how to get the yeast out. So what they do is they freeze the neck of the bottle where the yeast is, and then via machinery they're going to pop the caps off. The compression is going to cause this ice plug to shoot out, and then you're left with a bit of gap in the bottle where you need to add some more wine. During the last adding of this wine is where they will be able to pinpoint how much sugar they're going to get in their wine. So that's how champagne is made, and it imparts a bit of a unique taste to the wine because the dead yeast is making the wine taste a certain way. We'll pop this bottle in a minute and do some tasting and figure out how does it actually taste. And like I said, you can get wines that are made by that, like that. Cava in South Africa, in California, they will also make wines that are like champagne, but at least in my opinion, they are not complete champagne. The whole package of the weather, the grape varieties, really give, for me, a unique taste to champagne. Now let's talk vintage versus non-vintage. Most of the champagne you come across is probably going to be non-vintage, and it's a bit self-explanatory. There is not a single vintage that's in that champagne. It's made from multiple vintages. The trick with this, so usually a bigger champagne house of Veuve Clicquot, Moet and Chandon, they're trying to preserve a certain flavor profile to their wine, such that when you go to a store, you pull a Moet off the shelf, you expect it to taste the same year after year after year after year. Over decades and hundreds of years, they're trying to replicate that same flavor independently of what the weather might have been like during that vintage. So it's actually quite a challenge, and it's a specialty in its own of how to keep all these wines in-house and be able to blend it consistently to always reproduce the same flavor profile. Now, there's also vintage champagne. So this on my left is a non-vintage champagne. I'll show you a bit of the label in a minute. This here is a vintage champagne. In a vintage champagne, all of the wine, all of the grapes producing that wine are harvested in the same year, or almost all in the same year. I'm not 100% sure with champagne. In some of the regions, they allow you maybe 5% from another vintage to be blended in. But let's assume it's all from the same year. What then typically happens, most champagne producers that produce vintage champagne don't produce it every year because the weather is so tricky in that region. You want the vintage champagne, let's say, to be special, and they just can't do it every year. They pick out vintages where the weather was particularly good, where the harvest conditions were good, and then they're going to produce that vintage champagne, which is usually at a premium price point relative to non-vintage champagnes. Now, there's also quite a difference in the flavor. Typically, vintage champagne, it has more of an oxidized flavor to it. It's usually aged for a longer period of time, so that's also contributing to the oxidation. The fruit is probably more ripe, so you're getting, again, a different flavor. Instead of the apples tasting raw, just picked off the tree, it's going to taste like more of a stewed fruit type of composition. It probably, on the yeast, also spends a significant more time. And from the yeast, you're getting flavors of brioche, croissant, sourdough bread. It's usually described in this way, toast, and that's the flavor that's coming from the yeast. So usually a lot more flavor in a vintage champagne. That doesn't mean that vintage is better than non-vintage. It could also depend on what you're using it for, what you're pairing it with, and also what is your own personal style. If you like your wines very cool and crisp tasting, then you're probably going to like a non-vintage, and why pay a premium for a vintage champagne when this is much more readily available off the shelf. If we look at the label of a vintage wine, you'll usually see the year. Could be on the front of the label, it could be on the back of the bottle. If it is a non-vintage wine, if we look at the label of a vintage wine, sometimes it will say specifically non-vintage, sometimes you just won't be able to find what the vintage is. And in the case of this wine, this Maurice Grumier, there's a note on the back label that says Reserve Perpetuel. This is a bit of a newer style of making these non-vintage wines where they use a Solera system to be able to continuously mix these wines. That's the Perpetuel part. The Solera system will go into another video on sherries, but I know by looking at that word that this is a non-vintage champagne. Now let's look at how to serve champagne. So first, starting with the stemware. You probably most frequently see champagne poured into a flute, which is this glass here. It's very narrow and tall. It's great for pouring champagne if you just like to see the bubbles and getting a lot of froth. So it's mostly for the visual. It's actually a very poor glass to drink the champagne. You don't get enough of the nose of the wine. There's not enough air going into the champagne. So I get very frustrated, especially at a good restaurant, if they choose to pour champagne in a glass like this. If you want to go Great Gatsby style, you could use a coupe glass, as they call it. This I like because you get some air, so you're able to get that aroma on the nose and start to transform a bit the taste and profile of the wine. However, the lack of depth in the glass, you only fit a little bit of champagne in here. So it's great if the bottle is out and you're able to quickly pour and top off, but you certainly wouldn't see this glass used in a restaurant if they were pouring measured pours by the glass. For me, perfect glass using a white wine glass. This is what Zalto calls a universal glass. This is actually perfect for champagne. If you really like the drinking and the flavor of champagne, it won't give you as much of a head or froth or a spectacular bubble look, but for the drinking of champagne, this is the proper glass. Now let's talk about serving champagne. First of all, the temperature to serve at. I would not serve refrigerator cold. I think 10 degrees for a vintage champagne. You could go a little bit warmer on a vintage champagne, so I would go 10 degrees C. On a non-vintage champagne, somewhere 7 to 10 degrees, depending on the champagne. I would not pull it cold out of the refrigerator. Cold out of the fridge, you just lose a lot of the flavor of it. The cold temperature kind of traps it in. Now we need to get the cork out of the champagne. They're often covered in foil, so we first need to get the foil off. Then you want to remove the wire cage that's over the cork. The term of this is called a muselet. This is a good pub quiz question. To be safe, you always, once the foil is off, you want to keep your hand on the top of the bottle. It's 6 counterclockwise half turns to be able to undo the wire. And especially from this point, always have your hand on top. Do not pop the cork and shoot it off of the ceiling. It's actually quite dangerous to do. And you want to get the cork out with. Now that we have the right glass and the cork is out of the bottle, let's go ahead and pour and see how this champagne looks. Looking at the color, this is typical of a non-vintage. It's not going to be as golden as a vintage champagne would be. Flavor-wise, it's going to tend to be crisp. You should get apple, lemon, pear on the nose from the fruit, and like I said, it's going to be a bit of fresh picked apple and pear, that white flavor to it, not something that has been cooked. And you'll get a lot of the notes of the yeast, a bit bread, a bit toasty here. Now, something that I will get into to try to figure out what type of champagne is the right taste for you. The sugar content is key. When I was describing the process by which they make champagne, when you do the disgorgement of the champagne, this ice plug with the yeast shoots out of the bottle, you have to refill it with something. And when they refill it, they're precisely choosing how much sugar in the replacement fluid is going to go into the wine to get the sugar level. And it's just what the house brand likes, how they want their wine to taste, and how the customers expect that wine to taste. You'll often see labeling brut as being the term to describe the dryness, brut nature or zero dosage are terms used to describe typically the most dry type of champagne. This means when they add the extra fluid in, they don't add any more sugar into the liquid. So this will be the driest in the range, and then you get sweeter and sweeter. And if you learn this nomenclature that is often used on the bottle, you can kind of figure out what the sweetness range would be. It's either 0 to 3, 3 to 6 grams of sugar per liter, 6 to 12, and so on. So I would suggest you try some different champagnes based on the sugar level. And from that, this might be the first thing that gets you to figure out what type of champagne you like. And then if you're choosing bottles where you haven't tasted that champagne before, choose the bottle based on the sugar content. Once you figure out what is the sugar content that you like, you also need to figure out, do you like non-vintage or vintage champagne better? Now, what to pair champagne with? A great thing that I like about champagne is I don't need to plan something far up front to drink the champagne. With an old bottle of Bordeaux, I'm going to be so fixated on what food pairing is going to go with this Bordeaux such that it's the perfect match. I like champagne that you could just drink it on its own. If you're in the wine snob circles, fried chicken in champagne is considered to be kind of the gold standard of wine pairing. Even a Kentucky Fried Chicken together with champagne is great. So it's that saltiness, deep fried. It could go great with French fries, fried calamari. You can even go towards some meats. You do charcuterie is great because again the saltiness goes quite well with the champagne. Famous with also oysters and seafood. I would go with something a bit creamier. You could go maybe a bit sweeter champagne or a non-vintage champagne if you have like a pasta with cream sauce, chicken with cream sauce, and you can go with something like a pork and sauerkraut. Could be great. I might go with a little bit of sweetness in the wine, but a dish like that pork and sauerkraut, something sour tart, can go very well with champagne. So there's actually quite a lot that can pair with champagne, or it could stand on its own. The alcohol percentage is typically 11 to 13%, so not big alcohol wines, and there's just a lot to do. You could just go hop on a boat and pop open a bottle of champagne. Is always great. So you're probably thinking, what do you do now? Can I give you some information to go head out to the store and start drinking some great champagne? The first step you could do, what's readily available, some of the house brands. So Pommery, Veuve Clicquot, Moet and Chandon are probably readily available close by. You could start with that, and like I said, I would dial in on how much sugar is in those wines. If you then want to expand, get more into a grower producer, recommendation I have, I've been to Champagne, visited with Franck Pascal. I came across this wine in just a tasting or pairing somewhere. I didn't know anything about it, loved the wine. Went to go visit him. Fantastic guy, starting a little house that his grandfather built, and then he took us out into the vineyards and spent quite a lot of time there, and then took us back into his grandfather's house and let us drink anything that he had on site. So I think he makes some spectacular wines. Thanks for sticking through this video on champagne. I hope you were able to learn a lot. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe to my channel, and you will get updates on whatever is coming next. If you have a suggestion of something that you would like me to talk about or to drink, please leave a comment below and I'll think about getting another video out there soon. Thanks again for joining.